The story of Masada, and in particular the story of the mass suicide, for Josephus, is not a myth. People ask me, what do you think about the myth of Masada? But who says it's a myth?
I mean, if you erase, for example, Josephus' account of what happened on Masada, all you have is a fortress with a siege system around it, period. You have no story.
It's like a court story. Someone says he saw someone who saw someone. We're looking for much more concrete evidence.
If you push me to the corner and you ask me if I think that they committed suicide, the short answer is yes. The far more longer answer is that it's more complicated than that.
It is one of the most iconic stories of the Jewish people, a story which affected not only the core of history, but influenced many people for thousands of years. It still echoes in the region and beyond. Masada and the Great Jewish Revolt, where a group of Jewish rebels, so it is believed, refused to succumb to the Roman victory and chose to commit mass suicide. Experts found evidence dating back to the Iron Age on the mountaintop. But when talking about Masada, the first figure who comes to mind is King Herod the Great, who lived in the 1st century BCE. Herod, king of Judea, was one of the most prominent leaders in the region. He is credited with rebuilding the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and has built some landmark sites such as Caesarea, Sebastia, and Herodium. He arrives on Masada in 40 BCE.
First of all, it's a natural fortress. And as was often the case, Herod would build his palaces and fortresses where the Hasmonean dynasty had built theirs previously. And so Herod decided very early on to build a last refuge, a stronghold, where he could come and hold out against his enemies if and when they ever came after him. So who were his enemies? Well, on the one hand, many Jews hated him because he wasn't descended from David, and many Jews felt that he had stolen the throne. He was not from an aristocratic Jewish family. His father was Idumean, his mother was a Nabatean princess, and many Jews hated him. But in fact, his real enemy was Cleopatra, the queen of the Nile, who coveted this area where there were oases by the Dead Sea, where they were growing the balsam plant, from which they were extracting the oil to make perfume. And Herod was very much afraid that Cleopatra was going to march north with the Egyptian army to conquer this area. And that's the main reason why he built Masada as a last refuge.
On Masada, Herod manages to recover from a defeat on the battlefield and plot his return to power. He built a magnificent 3-level palace on the top of the fortress. It was one of the most luxurious compounds of ancient times.
The palace was built on the northern cliff of Masada on 3 levels. It's a hanging palace. And of course, the upper level was where Herod had his own private apartment, because that was the breeziest and coolest of any part of Masada. And then on the middle and lower levels, he had places apparently for entertaining very important guests. On this lowest level, there was a small bathhouse where we think the king relieved himself and made himself comfortable.
Masada became a small kingdom for Herod. Alongside the northern palace, we can see other magnificent structures, emphasizing the luxurious life Herod and his people led.
Herod had the best of everything. So he had a complete Roman bathhouse consisting of 4 parts. The outer room where we came in, the apoditarium, the lobby, the small cold plunge bath, the frigidarium. Then we came through the middle, medium-sized bath, the tepidarium, the warm bath. Now we're sitting in the largest and most impressive of the 4 baths, the caldarium. There was a steam bath, hot bath. And there was a furnace here where hot air was heated, and the hot air flowed between a double floor. You see these small columns supported the upper floor and the wall. The hot air came between the 2 floors up the clay pipes that we see embedded in the plaster walls. Over here we see a reproduction of the clay pipes. To make steam, all you had to do was pour water on the walls of the floor. Psh, you had your schwitz. The Western Palace was the single largest building complex on Masada. And it was here that Herod had his center of power, his offices, it was his administrative center. He had his throne room here. So this is basically where he took care of business. But don't you know that if the king is here in the palace for any amount of time, he needs to be comfortable. So we found a bath there for the king's comfort and other installations to keep the king comfortable while he was working, taking care of business in the Western Palace.
After Herod's death, Masada declined. It later was stationed by a Roman garrison, but that was only the first chapter in this site's history. The most dramatic events in the history of the region were still to come: the Great Jewish Revolt. The year is 66 CE. Palestine is ruled by the great Roman Empire. Jewish society is torn and divided into 20 to 25 sects or cults.
Elazar ben Yair was of the Sicarii faction, but he had a valuable lesson which he could have taught to the other leaders of the rebellion and Jewish society in general, and that lesson was how to unify a diverse group of people.
In 66 CE, the Sicarii Jewish zealots overtake Masada from the Romans. After the successful conquer, the Sicarii make Masada their permanent base. The siege on Masada was long and intense. The Sicarii Jewish rebels used Masada's old facilities to reinforce their stronghold. Such were the famous storerooms. However, the identification of the storeroom is in dispute.
Okay, we're entering one of the reconstructed storerooms here on Masada. It's pretty safe to say that they played a crucial role in everything that happened here. Without the storerooms and the supplies that were in them, there's no way that the drama could have occurred, because there was something like 1,000 people here. And in order to sustain these people for the length of time that they were here, you would need more than they were able to bring with them. Now, there's 4,000 square meters of storerooms, which is a lot. Some of them were uniquely designed in order to contain liquids such as wine and olive oil. Josephus describes the sheep, poultry, and we know they raised doves that were up here, but that wouldn't have been enough. He also describes in detail massive quantities of corn, lentils of different types, figs, and other types of supplies. Weapons, there was a very large supply of weapons up here, which the rebels would have used. So once again, without what they found here, there would have been no way for the people to last out the months of the siege and the months preceding the siege.
Another secret weapon of the Sicarii was the advanced water cistern, which was built during Herod's time.
I think secret weapon is a very good way to describe it. Water is absolutely essential to life, and there's no water in this part of the world, especially in this part of the desert. There are no wells that you can dig on top of the plateau, and they had to solve the problem. So what they did was they created an ingenious system of dams and aqueducts, which fed water into a series of tremendous cisterns, like the one that we have right here, which were spread out along the base of the mountain. So the water which fell, the annual rainfall which fell in the Jerusalem mountains to the west of us, was fed into this system, and it filled up the lower cisterns automatically. From there, it was brought up to the top manually. The water was brought in through two gates, the water gate and the gate which is adjacent to the snake path. And the upper cisterns were filled. Now, the system was so successful that they had water not only for drinking and bathing, but they had for 2 bathhouses. They had an almost Olympic-sized swimming pool. In other words, water was not a problem for them. The system was incredibly successful, and it solved one of the major problems of surviving out here in this incredibly harsh desert environment.
When the Romans closed in on Masada, the Sicarii chose a radical step: mass suicide, rather than falling into the hands of the Roman legion. The event is described in Josephus's famous book, War of the Jews.
Elazar gathered the most courageous of his companions together and encouraged them to take that course by a speech. Slay their own wives and children with their own hands. These people died with this intention, that they would not leave so much as one soul among them alive to be subject to the Romans. Now for the Romans, they expected that they should be fought in the morning. They came within the palace, and so met with the multitude of the slain, but could take no pleasure in the fact, though it were done to their enemies. Nor could they do other than wonder at the courage of their resolution, and the immovable contempt of death which so great a number of them had shown, when they went through with such an action as that was.
Over the years, the validity of the story of Masada has been questioned and doubted. Professor Nachman ben Yehuda, an anthropologist from the Hebrew University, wrote the book Masada Myth, Collective Memory and Myth-Making in Israel. One of ben Yehuda's main claims is that the story of Masada is reported by only one source, by historian Josephus, who himself wasn't on Masada at the time of the siege, and based his book on second-hand accounts.
What Josephus tells us is based, supposedly, we don't know, we guess, A, on the commentary that Roman commanders sent to Rome, which we don't have, but we assume that's what happened, and there were 7 survivors from the suicide or collective suicide on Masada, and at least one of the women is described by Josephus as a wise old woman. And again, the hypothesis is that this woman told the Romans what happened just prior to the act of suicide.
One of the most dramatic scenes in Josephus's book is the speech of Elazar ben Yair, leader of the Sicarii rebels.
Since we long ago resolved never to be servants to the Romans, nor to any other than to God himself, who alone is the true and just Lord of mankind, the time is now come that obliges us to make that resolution true in practice. We were the very first that revolted, and we are the last to fight against them. And I cannot but esteem it as a favor that God has granted us, that it is still in our power to die bravely and in a state of freedom.
We have 2 speeches by Elazar ben Yair, leaders of the Sicarii in Masada. He turns to the people and says, I was sent by destiny. We need to kill ourselves. He mentions all the reasons for suicide, the separation between body and spirit, that they'll be considered as heroes. He says the Romans will see this act eventually as a nobility. They're sure that we'll surrender, but no, we will not surrender. We'll show them that we didn't do this act from desperation, but from an understanding, from agreement. He says, look, we are the last of the Jewish people. Let's end this saga with dignity.
But for Professor ben Yehuda, the description of this speech by Josephus is not convincing.
He quotes twice the two speeches that were made by Elazar ben Yair, the last Sicarii commander of Masada. Well, the tape recorder was about 2,000 years in the future, and he wasn't there.
The ongoing debate between different scholars and experts is more important than ever. The disbelievers of the Masada myth even suggest that a Roman attack on Masada was only a military maneuver. Dr. Yehiam Sorek, a historian who researched the Roman Empire era, also questions the Battle of Masada.
We see the Roman ballista stones. We also see on the top of Masada huge stones that were meant to be thrown down on the Romans. Some of them were not found down on the mount. There's a chance there wasn't even a battle at all.
Gary Litwin, who is a tour guide and an explorer, is quite familiar with all sides of the story.
But when you take the pieces of the puzzle and you put them together, you look at the whole, you get a picture which is actually very similar, if not almost identical, to the picture drawn by Josephus Flavius in his description of what happened here. Now, there are a number of reasons why I say this. First, Josephus Flavius more or less established his credentials as a historian. Now, there were times when he seems to have exaggerated as far as numbers go, but generally when he describes battles, places, events, objects, very often he is backed up by archaeology and by findings in the field. One of the best examples is the disposition of the Roman army and what they did here as described by Josephus Flavius in his book. Now, there were survivors. Not everyone killed himself. There was an old woman, a younger woman, who was described as unusually intelligent. She was a relative of Eleazar ben Yair, and they were taken to Rome and interrogated, along with 5 children, who also managed to hide and avoid the mass suicide. The testimony that she gave was entered officially into the Roman military records. Now, Josephus had access to these records. He also had contemporaries, and this is very crucial, people who were alive, who had been eyewitness to the events, who had been soldiers in the Roman army, who actually saw what went on up here. It wouldn't have been a secret back then, and it wasn't ancient history for them, and it's very, very hard to imagine that he would have fabricated a fantastic story like that without being taken to task very severely by his contemporaries, by people who actually saw what happened.
For many years, this story was a symbol of Jewish resistance and courage. It fueled the Zionist movement in the early 20th century, a movement which called for the formation of a Jewish state in the land of Israel.
During the 18th and 19th century, the national movements were looking for heroes. The Austro-Hungarians, the Germans, the French, the Russians, everyone, and also the Zionists. They found it in Judah the Maccabee, Bar Kokhba, and so on. This is where the myth begins.
Even before the formation of the State of Israel, Zionist groups used to climb Masada. It was a symbol of Jewish redemption, a yearning for a time when Jews stood up and fought for their place in the Holy Land. In 1926, Jewish poet Isaac Lamdan wrote the famous poem Masada, which exemplifies the Zionist myth. Lamdan writes in his poem,
"And if to find atonement I survive, then answer, where?" So importuning a silent voice replied, "In Masada." And I obeyed that voice, and so I came.
Later, the expression Masada will not fall again became another substantial mantra and a tool to encourage Jewish Zionism.
בשנת 1942, כשצבאות רומל עמדו
In 1942, the entire Jewish settlement was standing on its back legs. Rommel's forces were about to take over Israel. There was a secret plan called the North Plan, or the Carmel Plan, Masada of the North, in which the entire public will gather on Mount Carmel and kill themselves in case of a Nazi invasion. They will fight to the death.
If I would have been, let's say, one of the leaders of the Zionist movement in the 1930s or 1920s, I need heroic stories. I need to show the people I want to lead that there were always Jews in this area. And Jews not only were present here, they were willing to fight and they were willing to die for their country.
The myth surrounding Masada continues even after the creation of the State of Israel. Between 1963 and 1965, diggings on Masada peaked when it was excavated by a team of professional archaeologists headed by the late Hebrew University professor who became a politician, Yigael Yadin. It was the most complex archaeological project of that time, with hundreds of volunteers from different countries around the world.
It was very military orientated in those days, you know, because most people have been in the army. All the archaeologists, I think, have been in the army, and it was on very military lines, but it was well organized.
But the years to come put the Masada myth in dispute. A new school of thought rises in the Israeli academia, which opposes traditional values and questions some of the core premises of Israeli studies. The opponents of the suicide myth mention other major points to support their theory. For example, the fact that the story is not mentioned in other texts of the time, not even Jewish texts.
This event in Masada, the so-called suicide, occurs in 73 CE. Now, the Jewish Tanaim and the Talmud literature doesn't mention any event of the Great Revolt. Only Jerusalem. It doesn't mention Masada either, not even the name Masada.
Ze'ev Meshel is one of the first Israelis to explore Masada. He bases his assumption on both the reporting in Josephus's book and evidence on the ground, evidence like the remains of the Roman siege.
The complete siege system proves that the Jews did not surrender in the middle of the battle. You see these remains, you see the tremendous efforts of the Romans. And until today, when I go to Masada and look west to the military battery, I can hear the Roman Caesar's order, by any price, you must take this place, by any price.
Dr. Dan Bahat, a well-known archaeologist who also excavated Masada during the 1960s, dismisses the allegations of the Masada myth.
As typical in Israel, you know, everybody is trying to kill legends. So let them kill it, and the archaeology will prove that. We found, and it was my personal, with my own hands, I still shiver when I describe it, we found those 10 pottery shards, which were a part of this lethal lottery, which is described by Josephus Flavius. When they choose by lottery, they choose 10 people in order to decide who will kill the rest of the men after the men kill their families. The fortunate thing and the interesting, actually there were found 11. And amongst the 11, why did I say 10? Because one of the 11 was Ben Yair, who was commander of Masada. So I don't think that we need more proof than that.
The so-called lottery room is an essential part of the story. Josephus describes the Jewish rebels' decision to commit mass suicide by using lots. One of the main archaeological findings on Masada is a room where 11 lots were found with 11 names on them. The supporters of the mass suicide theory see this finding as a crucial piece of evidence.
Now, these lots were all found together in the same place. They were written with the same hand. They used the same ink, and apparently they came from the same jug. So you put all of that together, and you have a pretty convincing piece of evidence which backs up what Josephus Flavius actually said about what happened here.
Nevertheless, this evidence doesn't satisfy the opponents of the theory.
The lots, they found in Site 113, I think, a whole pile of garbage. Within that pile of garbage, they found some shards, I mean small stones with the name. On one of the stones, the name Ben Yair was written. Now, to find a shred, a piece of stone with the name Ben Yair on it on Masada is very suggestive. But if there were 960 people on Masada, if you go to Masada and you visit Site 113, it would take a shoehorn with a lot of power to cramp 960 people into that site. No, that wasn't the site. Now the question is, what were these shreds for? Could they have been the goralot, I mean the lots? Yeah, they could be. They could also be, little receipts for food, for rationing of foods.
Among many other points, Sorek also mentions the fact that there were no remains of the Sakari, who allegedly killed themselves.
If 1,000 people lived there, there must be urine signs. If 1,000 men were slaughtered, there must be blood traces there, and they checked it. The Romans usually didn't bury the corpses. They left it to Jews themselves to bury their dead. They excavated every inch in Masada and around it. They found nothing.
Suicide is forbidden in Judaism. In the book of Genesis, God tells Noah,
"And surely your blood of your lives will I require. At the hand of every beast will I require it, and at the hand of man."
However, the Bible mentions several cases of suicide, some of them described in a heroic way. According to Samuel 1, chapter 31, King Saul fell on his sword to avoid his capture by the Philistines after he lost the battle in the Gilad. Perhaps a key to understanding this phenomenon is the story of Gamla.
Gamla was a central Jewish town in the central Golan, and Jews settled there since the 1st century BC, at the time of Alexander Jannaeus, king of the Hasmonean dynasty. And since then, and until the first revolt, it was a vivid Jewish town. Its inhabitants were mainly farmers. They were cultivating the lands around here. The place is a little bit hard to live, as you can see. It's a very isolated hill, and it's hard to walk down and up, but that's what they had.
Gamla is considered as the Masada of the north. The events which took place here during the Great Jewish Revolt are to some extent similar to those hundreds of kilometers to the south, on Masada. Dr. Mordecai Aviam, who has been researching the Great Jewish Revolt in the Galilee and Golan, says that unlike other Jewish cities in the area, the Jews in Gamla resisted the Roman attack.
At Gamla, there is a very large group of Roman military equipment, part of armors, part of shields, part of helmets, in a large number. And that's something that we don't have, for example, at Yodfat or even in Jerusalem. It means that many soldiers, many Roman soldiers were hit during this collapse. Their bodies were taken a few days later when the Romans conquered the town. Therefore, we don't find the bodies or the skeletons of the Roman soldiers because they were taken. But parts of the Roman equipment, army equipment, is there between the debris, and therefore the archaeology, the excavations prove that Josephus' description is almost accurate.
After a first failed attempt to conquer Gamla, the Roman forces struck back.
It took a few more days, and 2 Roman soldiers climbed up and started to dig below the high round tower, which is on my back over there. And after digging it collapsed. There was a big noise at night. Jews were frightened. People start climbing up and running up on the hill. And the morning after, the Romans entered the town, climbing up step by step, shooting and pushing the Jews back to the top of the hill, to the hump of the camel. This is the origin of the name of Gamla, camel. And at the very end, the Romans were down below shooting up, Jews shooting from up, down, from west to east, and suddenly a strong east wind came.
What happened on top of the cliff is described in Josephus's book, Wars of the Jews, Book 4, Chapter 1.
So the Romans got up and surrounded them, and some they slew before they could defend themselves, and others as they were delivering up themselves. And the remembrance of those that were slain at their former entrance into the city increased their rage against them. Now, a great number also of those that were surrounded on every side, and despaired of escaping, threw their children and their wives, and themselves also, down the precipices into the valley beneath, which, near the citadel, had been dug hollow to a vast depth.
Though many see this as a description of mass suicide, Dr. Aviam has another explanation.
At the very end of the war, the town was conquered by the Romans, and the Jews fled into the crest, into the top of Gamla, which, according to Josephus' description, was like a camel hump. On the north-western side, the slopes are very steep, and Josephus' description is that the people who found shelter here took their children and their wives and jumped down to the slopes. That's Josephus' words. He wasn't here, of course. What he probably had is a description comes from the mouth of soldiers or Roman officers who were here, who came here at the very end of the war. And what they saw is hundreds and hundreds of people, men, women, and children, on the slopes, many dead, many wounded. And what he took from there is a story of suicide, mass suicide. The matter of fact is that if you are very frightened at the end of a war, the enemy with blood in the eyes are climbing, following you, and you have nothing else to do, then you are trying to escape and taking your children and wives and start to run down from these slopes, you probably find yourself on the ground, wounded, and being wounded in the 1st century, broken legs, broken arms, is doomed to death. There's no doubt about that.
Though Josephus was not present on Masada or in Gamla, he was actually in Yodfat in the Galilee. Yodfat in the year 67 CE was the site of the first battle between Jews and Romans in the Great Revolt. Back then, Josephus was called Yosef ben Matityahu and was the Jewish governor of the region.
The Romans are trying to attack the town from the breach, but they failed. The Jews succeeded in stopping them on the breach, and the Romans had to retreat. This was the first attempt to take the town. The entire siege took here some 47 days, according to Josephus. And finally, after 47 days, the town was conquered by what we call today a commando attack. Some good soldiers climbed very, very early in the morning before sunrise and killed the guards and let the Roman army climb over the walls and conquering the town.
After the Romans took Yodfat, Josephus, with 40 prominent residents of Yodfat, hid in one of the caves in the area along the way. At that moment of agony and distress, the people decided to take their own lives, using lots, a scene described in Josephus's book.
And now, said he, since it is resolved among you that you will die, come on, let us commit our mutual deaths to determination by lot. He whom the lot falls to first, let him be killed by him that hath the second lot. And thus fortune shall make its progress through us all, nor shall any of us perish by his own right hand. For it would be unfair if, when the rest are gone, somebody should repent and save himself.
Josephus's description of Yodfat is seen as highly accurate, since archaeologic remains match the written account. However, Dr. Aviam has doubts about the suicide story.
This is, of course, a very genre story. For myself, I do not believe in the mass suicide that is so common in Josephus, whether it is Yodfat, Gamla, Jerusalem, Masada, but rather a piece of the story that should hit the reader with grief, with sad, with horror, with how bad the war is, that people are doing the worst thing, which is committing suicide. So how it really happened, what really happened at Yodfat, of course, I cannot tell. We don't have any archaeological evidence for the end of Josephus' story at Yodfat concerning his own life.
Could it be that Josephus used the theme of suicide to glorify the story of Yodfat, and then reused it for the same purpose when he described the Battle of Masada?
Yosef ben Matityahu was the bad boy of a very prestigious family of Cohens.
בסופו של דבר הוא מוצא את עצמו, כן? מה שנקרא כאילו איזשהו עכברון כזה.
Eventually he found himself like a scared mouse in Yodfat. He got there and needs to convince a group of Jews to surrender to the Romans.
מה זה עושה לי?
Dr. Sorik suggests that the Sicarii did not commit suicide on Masada, but rather fled the area. They continue to be a substantial part of the Jewish resistance against the Roman Empire, including an event which took place 57 years later in Cyrene province. It's in Libya.
There were 8 Roman bases, 7 occupied bases, and 1 fake one. Maybe the Sicarii knew that they escaped to the desert to Egypt and then to Cyrene, and there maybe they are prepared for the launching of a revolt. By the way, Josephus himself hints that the Sicarii moved to Egypt and Cyrene, and it was a small group, but it's still something to dismiss the story of the suicide.
Dr. Doron Saravi, a historian from Herzog College, has another explanation.
When we are talking about a myth, systematically we are detaching from the historic core and from the academic research, and you build insights which are dependent on the generation and the time in which you lived. If we detach the subjective layer and really try to understand the story, I think it is reasonable to understand why the researchers of the last decades have come to the conclusion that it is more important to understand what Josephus has tried to say than how much his story is valid. Josephus looks to his left and to his right. He sees Jews who became slaves in the Roman legion and served as sailors in the Roman forces. He sees that Jews are spreading around. A Jew who stands where he stands understands that it will only take 3 to 4 generations until the Jewish people will disappear from the world.
Nearly 2,000 years after it fell into Roman hands, the story of Masada is still a mystery. But despite the voices who oppose the Masada myth, the glory of Masada has only increased over the years. It became a must-see spot for leaders and celebrities who come to visit Israel.
Good morning, everybody.
It is a major spot for rock concerts and operas. Last year, the first archaeological expedition in 10 years climbed the mountain. The group, led by Dr. Guy Stiebel, aims to find more evidence, clues, and perhaps even answers to the many unanswered questions of Masada.
I found wine jars with a label I know that belong to King Herod the Great. We actually know the title of King Herod the Great from a dump that we discovered several years ago here on top of Masada, and we thought that his title was King of the Jews. Well, now we know for sure from a dump that I excavated here what was his title. So you find evidence for fish sauce, for apples that were brought from Italy to the king, or fish sauce that came from Spain. It's not less dramatic than the big question about death.
The new excavations do not just focus on the Great Revolt, but on daily life, here in a remote place in the Judean desert. One of the questions that remains a mystery is the connection between the Sicarii cult and another famous Jewish cult at that time, the Essenes. According to new studies on Masada, the Sicarii were not the only group of Jews who lived on Masada during the Great Revolt.
We're dealing with a range of contexts here. So we've found coins from the revolt. We've found animal bones and remains from the Western palace crisis architecture. And, you know, we come down and you see everything as it was forgotten. And what a privilege, you know, it's thousands of years later.
Masada, a symbol of Jewish courage, a story of Jewish zealots who were ready to sacrifice themselves, or a myth that was used for political purposes.
Normally in archaeology, we do not find answers, we find new questions.
When Patrick Henry told Americans to give me liberty or give me death, when Britons sing, rule Britannia, Britons never shall be slaves, when Canadians say, true north, strong and free, this is the universal message of Masada, that we are free people and we should never take our freedom for granted.
I think the ramifications and the importance of what happened here at Masada cannot possibly be overstated. Judaism underwent a virtual revolution. After the rebellion was crushed, Yochanan ben Zakkai and others of his generation transformed Judaism into something which could exist without a center to its universe because the temple was gone, enabled the Jews to survive under conditions of dispersal and exile. But basically, it turned the Jews from a nation into a religion.
The Sicarii, it's hard to compare and not fair, but they remind me of the hilltop youth. You see what people are capable of doing with certain ideals, with confidence that what they are doing is God's will.
אידיאלים מסוימים. People are intrigued by Masada. There is something we don't know. I mean, it's like the whole story of people committing suicide, putting a siege. Why did the Roman have to go all the way to Masada? So 960 people sit there. Why put a siege on Masada from all places? The collective suicide. What's going on? I mean, what kind of thing is this? So it bogs your mind. You want to find out, like, what happened?
I put this story, like so many others, to the question marks drawer.
This is the question that we need to answer. What did Josephus try to tell us, rather than the question of what actually happened? Because until we find the black box of Masada, or the recording device of the women who were witnesses to the last moments, the questions will remain open forever, and the myth will continue to be cherished or dismissed by anyone who wants to use this story for their own purposes.